Good morning, good afternoon, happy Veterans Day, and happy Armistice Day. Welcome to our webinar, Master the Virtual Handshake. I'm Amanda Seeger with BlueJeans by Verizon. And this is the second webinar in a three-part SMB webinar series, the new online non-negotiables, hosted by BlueJeans by Verizon and Yahoo Small Business. So before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping notes. All attendees, you're in view and listen only mode, so you won't be able to interact with us verbally, but we would encourage you to engage with us using the chat features that you see on your screen. So if you look to the right side of your screen, you'll see a couple icons. There is a chat looking icon where you can engage with us, and our team on the back end will answer any questions or post some questions back to you. We also have a poll, which we might engage throughout the webinar. And then we have a Q&A icon. Feel free to throw any questions in there. If they're relevant to the conversation we're having right now, then I'll pull them into the conversation. If not, we'll follow up with as many as we can after the fact. And lastly, this webinar will be recorded and shared after the event. So let's go ahead and get started. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our guests, Adam Kniezer, owner of Burghundy LLC, and Jessica Reeves, marketing manager at Yahoo Small Business. So welcome, guys. Do you mind just saying hello and a few things about yourself?
Sure. It's my pleasure to be here. My name is Adam Kniezer, as mentioned, and I am the founder of Burghundy LLC, and I'm based here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I have lived for roughly 10 years. And so, Jessica, a little bit about you as well.
Yeah, I'm Jessica Reeves, and I am a marketing manager with Yahoo Small Business. I am also the publishing editor for the Yahoo Small Business Resource Center, where we have a lot of information that we like to provide to our small businesses to help them through different opportunities and roadblocks. So,
great, thank you guys. And Adam, you broke out my goblet. There's water in it, don't worry.
And so, today, given the time, but you know what? It's 5 o'clock, I think, everywhere in 2020, so it's all right.
Exactly. So today we're talking about some of the changes small businesses have had to make over the last few months in order to land new business and develop relationships with future and current clients. And unless you've been an online-only business, it's been quite a transition, moving away from face-to-face presentations, demos, meetings, lunches, et cetera, right? And there's a lot of factors to consider, everything from security and technological challenges to awkward silences, body language, cultural barriers. And, Adam, I think it's great to start with you. We'd love to learn more about your business and how you've made the switch from in-person to online relationship building.
Sure. And so to give a little bit of background, of course, what Burghundy's aim is wine education is the primary focus of what I do. I also consult for local establishments here in the Pittsburgh area, and I write for local publications as well as international ones like Wine Folly and others. And so I primarily am in a consumer-facing role. I know a lot of people in the wine industry are in the business of training other professionals, and I do that as well, but I primarily focus on you as a consumer. And so what I had traditionally been doing is teaching in person at various locations here in the greater Pittsburgh region. But once mid-March came about, I kind of knew that I was going to have to make some sort of change. And what I wound up doing is kind of taking an idea, online classes that I had already been contemplating, but the situation forced my hand. And so what I was able to do was do a quick search for the tools and platforms that were available to me. And because of the uncertainty of the situation, I wanted to find a tool that could maybe give me the flexibility to plug and play, but also gave me options to evolve as time went on. Because again, when it was March 13th and 14th, we really didn't have a good sense of what the future was going to look like. And BlueJeans gave me the flexibility to find something at a really easy price point that I could kind of customize and build my own solution in a lot of ways to meet my needs. And so what I wound up doing was now hosting classes via my website, which is burghundy.com, where you book, and then using the BlueJeans tool as my classroom, if you will. And so this presented me, of course, with challenges, but also I've discovered many more opportunities that I didn't even necessarily realize might be there. And what I've had the benefit of doing over the course of my professional career is already having a background in public speaking and education. And that really did, I think, prepare me for the moment. But it's the tool itself and the different modalities and functionalities of the tool that have allowed me to make that transition, I think, a bit more easily. But I will say, before we kind of get too far into the nitty-gritty of this, I think the biggest thing that people have to understand and realize is that online learning or an online medium is never going to be a one-to-one replacement for in-person interaction. Instead, it's about understanding that through this medium, we have to be able to be agile and adapt and see the opportunities that have been presented to us rather than just focusing on trying to recreate a one-to-one experience.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And that's probably a common challenge that a lot of other small businesses, and obviously you have a background in public speaking. Maybe this is a little bit easier for you. But, maybe Jessica, from a greater trends perspective, you see a lot of their small businesses making this transition. What are some of the things that you're seeing from a challenges perspective, not just maybe the technology, but, what do they do to get started?
Right. So, as the different restrictions that COVID has kind of put on small businesses, we have seen a large amount of them moving to kind of a completely virtual space. And if they have the opportunity, they're usually putting everything on the cloud, trying to figure out new opportunities for how to reach and connect with their customer base and make sure that everything is still moving forward. We have a lot of different resources available that we try to keep current and keep filling the different niches that we see pop up as COVID advances. But yeah, like Adam was saying, a lot of people are moving to teaching classes online. They're also putting together different virtual spaces where they can connect with their vendors and even manage their teams online. So it's definitely a new world. We're looking into more of these opportunities as people think about returning to the office after COVID, and then utilizing a lot of the new technologies that are available to kind of make this entire space more safe for both, our employees as well as the vendors we're working with. So.
Yeah, so it sounds like, there's a lot of factors to consider, not just how do you gain new clients, but that how do you manage your employees? How do you, just move your business completely online where you used to do it in person? So, Adam, to kind of dig into a little bit more of what your experience has been, how did you traditionally find new clients, and how did that change after moving into this virtual only world? And, I don't know if you would typically, maintain relationships in person, because like you said, it was predominantly clientele based in the Pittsburgh area. So how has that maybe expanded your reach to gain new clients and then maintain that relationship with them?
Well, the reach has really expanded, and I think that's the true benefit of using a virtual medium. But the challenge that I've seen for a lot of other individuals is kind of going back to this virtual handshake moment of, okay, well, I understand that these tools are available, but how do I actually make it work? And so, yes, I have a client base here in Pittsburgh, but having a virtual reach now means I have audiences not just here locally, but internationally. And so what that also means is that you have to be that much more aware of the fact that you do have an audience with maybe different sets of needs and expectations, different cultural contexts, and all of these things that you have to really understand and build in. And so what I think has been the important thing to understand is that, again, tying back to this, I don't have the same crutches as I might have in an in-person situation. Even things like body language and visual cues. When you're talking in a situation using an electronic medium like this, you have to think about the fact that when you're delivering in person, when you make a joke or a comment, even the little bit of feedback of hearing a little bit of a murmur in the room or laughter gives you a good finger on the pulse of what's going on. And that can be a real challenge using an electronic medium like this. And so to go back to what I was saying earlier about how this isn't just a one-to-one translation of an in-person to an online event, you have to kind of feel out other ways to get that feedback and get that engagement. And that's where I think a lot of people have struggled. So using a very concrete example from my experience, in an in-person class, a lot of things are already a given. You're going to show up, I'm going to teach you, and I'm also going to be able to do things like provide you with wine and things like that we can all do together. Well, now with an international audience or even a nationwide audience, that even is no longer a given. So I have to really rethink my approach to this. And I also have to understand that people's attention spans in an in-person environment are much longer and easier to retain for a longer period of time. So what I had to do, and what I think has been successful, is a rethinking and a reshaping of that. Maybe I can't use an electronic medium to replicate the fact that we're tasting 4 different wines and we're going to specifically discuss those 4 items. Maybe instead, now I understand that I have a wider reach where the same products might not be available, but I can still provide value to the end user. And it's just about reframing perhaps the topic at hand so that maybe I can talk about a region or a great variety topic at hand and choose one specific example that I will taste on my end. And so what I like to do in my class descriptions is give people a good idea of, here's what I'm going to be doing in the hour that we're discussing. Here's the wine that I specifically am going to be having, and I provide people with links so that they can purchase them if it's available in their market. But if they're not available, I give them alternatives. And I think the most important thing about making that transition from in-person to online is understanding that flexibility is going to be the most important thing that you can offer to a user. And I think reducing the barriers to participation and entry and allowing people to understand that, hey, listen, I don't necessarily have to have all of the things that you list here in order to get something out of this session, and then drawing them in and making them feel like they can participate. And that's why at the beginning of each session, I get everybody familiar with the functionality of the session, and I use the chat actually as a really great way to say, if you don't feel comfortable speaking on camera, that's totally fine. I understand that everybody lives on calls like BlueJeans, et cetera, these days, and maybe they just want a day off. So I give them that option, but I also help them understand how to use the platform at the same time that we can get them engaged. And so when I direct them to the chat, I'll say, where are you in the world right now? What do you have in your glass right now? Even if it's not what I have, this helps get people not only familiar with the tool itself, but also gives them the opportunity to engage in a way that's comfortable for them. So it's really, I think, a lot about meeting people where they are and where they feel comfortable so that they can feel empowered to participate regardless of where they are. And then through that discussion, that fosters a community in the classroom beyond the interaction that I have with them. And what's so great to see is that you have a lot of returning guests who now can say, oh, hey, Linda, I see that you're back for this session. What did you think about this wine? And that just enriches the discussion. That reach that a virtual medium like this can give you helps offset in some ways the inability to do exactly the same thing that you were trying to do before.
Yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah, and I mean, there are so many different ways that you can communicate with your customer base now and your employees. Like, you want to make sure that you give them the opportunities to express themselves with the tools that we have available. like you said, Adam, just like reach out through chat, through video, through social media. Different people learn and communicate in different ways. So we are seeing a lot of people experiment with what is available now, and whole new industries starting to open up to that are adapting to the current landscape. So I think you are completely on point there, Adam. It's all about meeting them where they are and then getting them to open up and express themselves in ways that beneficial to everyone.
And you have to be okay with things like a little bit of silence, but you also can work with things like this. And so there are going to be moments where there's a pause. And the problem is that when you're in a position like this, using an electronic medium, every second of silence somehow feels like 10 or 20 seconds of silence. But you have to understand that there has to be a comfort level with that. But use those moments where silence is going to be built in. So what I like to do is, understanding that some people might be typing questions instead of speaking aloud, I might go ahead and ask that question, ask people to contribute whatever their question is, their comment is, in the chat. And while I'm giving them that time to type out their question or their answer, that's where an anecdote comes in. That's where showing pictures comes in. That's where maps kind of come in as a way to fill some of that space and reduce that pressure of feeling this compulsion to fill it with things that maybe aren't necessarily useful. And I think that's another way that we can leverage an electronic medium in moving from an in-person kind of situation. It's that we do have the ability to cater to visual learners like that by showing images to give a richer experience. And I think you have to understand that using every possible element is going to make it that much more dynamic and that much more engaging for your user. When you're doing something like this, it's not quite necessarily as useful to just sit and speak directly to a camera for 50 to 60 minutes at a time. And that's why I do make sure that I break this up by showing maps, by showing pictures from my own travels, because we all learn differently, and we would all learn differently in person. It's just a different way to translate those kinds of changes into a strictly electronic medium. And it can still be very human because of that. I think people have this fear of an electronic medium as being a very sterile way to experience community and interaction. But I've seen firsthand it doesn't have to be that way, but it does rely a lot on you as sort of an individual who's maybe running the session or presenting the session to kind of inject a little bit more of yourself into it to maybe compensate for the fact that, again, you don't have those visual cues, you don't have those in-person body language markers that can create that warmth. You have to take advantage and leverage the different tools available to you in order to make that seem a little bit more of a true handshake as opposed to just virtual.
That makes sense. And we had a question come in about selling, positioning, and retention of B2B, so more in the IT industry. So, we're talking about more B2C and you're working with consumers. But I think, to answer that question, everyone's human, right? So approaching things the same way in a B2B environment is really just taking all of those tips and suggestions that you just said, setting the right expectations, reading the room, and having those tools available to you, whether it's any kind of communication tools or visual assets to help set the stage as to what it is that you're trying to get out of the conversation. And Jessica, I don't know if there's anything on the Yahoo website that you have that is specifically related to managing communications and virtual conversations, something more along the lines of perhaps psychology of it versus here are the tools, but maybe here are some tips, basically everything Adam just said, laid out, and here's how you would practice communicating virtually, because it is a different way of engaging with someone versus face-to-face. So I don't know if there's anything that you could point us to help those on the call get started and
Yes, definitely. We have a whole suite of different articles and videos, even a few comics thrown in there just for fun, on our resource center at that that are specifically, created to help small businesses that are encountering these different scenarios. When it comes to the virtual environment and how to kind of deal with COVID, we actually have a whole kind of microsite on the Resource Center that's specifically targeted to COVID, the different things that small businesses are running, small and medium-sized businesses are running into during this time, and how they can move to a more virtual environment, and then also kind of deal with that space. I have a whole article just dedicated to, how to think about, interacting with your team, what your team is going through, what they might find as great opportunities to get better at communicating with one another, different ways to kind of overcome the lack of, the water cooler experiences that we used to have in the office. Now we're going to have to recreate those kinds of interactions online and in a virtual space. That's an interesting thing that, different businesses are running into right now that we try to, as well as, setting up those connections with new vendors and new partners. Like that is something that used to be handled over lunch or, with a great presentation. But now it all has to be done, while people are at home and interacting with their families. So those are things that, you have to keep in mind when you are approaching these scenarios. Also, make sure that security is a huge aspect right now that people need to pay attention to, because we aren't all in the office. You want to make sure that everybody's on a VPN or has some sort of security in place, especially when you're talking to larger partners that you want to kind of break in with. But yeah, we have a bunch of information on our resource center.
Awesome. And I think Maggie threw that into the chat, and we'll send it out afterwards. So
Great.
Appreciate that. Yeah. And I would like to just switch over to what you mentioned about security, because I think that is a huge topic that came up at the start of COVID, with all the Zoom bombing and people taking access to these technologies that they hadn't previously. And I think it's interesting to think about what businesses have to go through, especially if they're engaging with clients that they've never had a conversation with, they don't have a relationship with, they don't know where they're joining from, whether it's the location or, are they in a compromised area over the VPN, like you said. So, Adam, any instances where you've had a security run-in or, that's good.
Which is fantastic. I don't think that people are necessarily finding what I have to be terribly sensitive information, which is fantastic. And I'm happy to say. And here's the other thing I want to kind of point out, that in a situation like this, it seems very tempting and easy to believe that everybody's going to take advantage of things in a situation like this. But what I've seen in my personal experience is that people actually haven't been taking advantage of things the way that you might fear that they will be. People are still people in a lot of ways. And I think this ties back to, Jessica, what you were just saying about the lack of sort of like water cooler environment and engagement. I want to be really clear about how in a virtual environment like this, you have to be very intentional about the time that you spend together. And I think this is where having structure means so much more than it did in an in-person environment, because getting that interaction is a much more intentional exercise. And so what I personally like to do is I build in moments where people know that after I'm done talking for 10, 15 minutes, we're going to pause and we're going to check in and make sure that everybody's on the same page. If there are questions, if there's anything that's outstanding, there's time for us to address that. And I think, again, it's about making people understand that we do have the time and ability, and I care about what is coming from you as a user as well, because engagement is a two-way street. And in a virtual medium like this, we don't have those informal cues as readily available to us. And so you have to be much more conscious of how you engage your audience, because it's not just as simple as somebody blurting something out in a room full of people, because on a situation like this, nobody wants to speak up and potentially step on somebody else who maybe had the same idea or wanted to say something too. And so structure has so much more importance now than it ever did before, because that's how you're going to much more successfully foster the kind of meaningful relationships and interaction, because otherwise we're really talking about a one-way street here. And then what's your incentive to come back if you don't feel like you were really part of the conversation? And so again, I'm sorry to move away from security, but Jessica, I think you touched on a really important point about making that handshake, moving away from in-person to a virtual world, is that you have to be so much more intentional about your structure and having a plan. And that's also helpful in avoiding awkward silences, because you know your path forward, you know where you're going to be moving from here, and it's less hanging and it feels a little bit less oppressive in that certain way.
And if you are sharing your content, there are other ways that you can safeguard against the Zoom bombers, right? You can include passcodes into your meetings. There are some features where you can drop someone as a moderator. So if someone's being a disturbance, you can just kick them out of your meeting. So, there's a lot of features that technology has today in order to guard against that. And, we have a whole page on our website which can provide some tips and best practices in order to make sure that if you're engaging with new clients, you are being safe and secure.
Yes. And I mean, if you are still kind of considering moving to a virtual space, but haven't fully got on board with it yet, we also have a package, we have a free package right now that'll get you completely online, just because this is a very trying time for people. I know we've been in this space for a while, but there are a lot of small businesses that are still, they've been trying to stay in that brick and mortar space, but just to continue to, provide resources for people, we do have a great package right now that'll get people online completely for free for a year. So, I mean, that at least will give you that first stepping stone to be able to communicate with everyone in a virtual space. Because like what Adam's been saying, you need to keep it very human. I mean, we're virtual, sure, computers can be daunting to some people, but it's really about lifting your whole team up, because they're part of your team for a reason. And you need to make sure that they're comfortable and they can get their ideas across. But
and Jessica, you're right. We're still people. The medium has changed, but we didn't stop being human. And I think that we just have this mental block in our minds, because I think the way we speak about these things, it almost inherently builds a roadblock, as if, well, I'm talking to you via a screen, so somehow that inherently reduces the amount of authenticity that might be part of a conversation. And I think we have to also just change the way that we think about this, because, the world didn't stop, right? We're still continuing, everything is still going on, but our humanity was never lost in that process, and we can still showcase that. But in order to help do that better, I will also say that who maybe don't have comfort using a medium like this, or maybe don't feel comfortable necessarily engaging and speaking, practice. And when I say practice, I mean seriously, record yourself speaking and also time yourself. Because what I will give as advice to anybody in a position like this who might be delivering content is that time seems to elapse differently when you're moderating or engaging or trying to host something like this. And what might feel like an eternity for you might just be 4 minutes. And then all of a sudden, now what? I have to fill the space. And how do people often do that? They ramble or they kind of muddy the message of what's going on. And so practicing is extraordinarily important if you don't have comfort doing this. And so it might be talking to your spouse or your family members, but I highly encourage you, especially given the virtual medium that's used, to record yourself using your phone or another tool and figure out what works for you. And or video like this, And then you can time yourself and understand, okay, so this is what delivery for 20 to 30 minutes feels like. And then build in those gaps, build in those times about understanding, okay, well, if I set aside 4 to 6 minutes for questions here, we can go ahead and move forward. And so again, structure and practice are really important. And then, I'm sorry, I did sneak off and I did see one question in the comments about maps and pictures. I just wanted to let folks know that in my particular circumstance, there are organizations out there who have maps available, but you don't necessarily know if you can use them. So my practice and what I've done is I've written to those individuals or organizations responsible for them, asking for permission, making sure that I kind of cover my bases of, I'd like to use this to illustrate points that I'm making in my class. Would that be all right with you? Because listen, we are all generating our own content in a lot of ways, and sometimes I think people don't think to ask for things like that and make sure that they're covering their bases too. I'm lucky in that I visited over 20 some regions on 5 continents, so I have a lot of my own personal materials from which to draw. But if you don't, make sure that you engage with the stakeholders or owners or creators of what you might like to incorporate into your offering to make sure that you have that permission. I know that sounds really basic and preliminary, but it's a very important step. And then that fosters a relationship, and that's an opportunity to create connections in business. The Society of Wine Educators, whose maps that I use, now I'm part of their network, and we knowledge share, and then we collaborate, and we're able to grow our network of people who are there kind of ultimately for the same purpose, which is, in our circumstance, wine. But it's another way to leverage experiences that you might not necessarily have had otherwise, and understanding, how can I frame this as an opportunity to maybe engage and broaden my reach? And I think that's the key in a situation like this, is understanding that, all right, it's going to be different, but it's about how I approach that difference. Am I approaching it with curiosity, or am I approaching it as this fear or blockade of things? You can't do this, you can't do this. Well, fine, but I can do X, Y, and Z instead.
Absolutely. So I know we're at time, and there are more questions coming in. So if anyone would like to add another question, we will stay on for a few more minutes. There were some more for you, Adam. Can you share your blueprint for structuring or some examples on how to demonstrate a physical product? I mean, in your case, it would be a physical product versus a software product, but maybe if you're demonstrating some bottles of wine or however you would, bring some physical aspect into it. Would you mind just quickly touching on that?
Yeah, sure. And so I do follow a little bit of a blueprint, generally speaking, when it comes to the class. And so this is something that I learned from my experience working in the clinical research sphere as a presenter at these meetings around the world. And so what I like to do is I structure this where a couple of minutes of introduction and housekeeping notes, and then I follow something of a script where I move into history to give context and background. Because wine, again, this is the subject matter in which I'm dealing, so that's my concrete example. I like to talk about how it's a place. And so it follows a formula: introduction, housekeeping, history, context, and geography. And then I bring it to a contemporary situation. And that's where I tie in the wine, perhaps, that I'm using as an example to illustrate the more broad or hypothetical concepts that I've got going. And so if I can follow that mental blueprint and that mental structure, I'm going to be much more successful in the end. And that helps create an expectation for the end user too, because they understand how the flow is going to go. And I make a point at the beginning of every session, even though there will be returning guests, there's always somebody there who's new and who doesn't understand and who might feel intimidated by the fact that these people all seem to know the drill by this point, but I'm new. So how do I get included into this conversation? And it's about making sure that you have that structure in place and that you enumerate that very clearly at the beginning so that everybody's expectations are aligned and they know exactly what to expect out of that. And so, again, it's a little bit less maybe traditional than a cut and dried, this is my product and this is how I'm selling it to you. It's much more about an understanding of the way and structure of a flow of an interaction to help bring new people in and make them feel comfortable without necessarily alienating folks who have been there for a while.
Those are great tips. Thank you. I know we're a little over time. I think if there's any other questions, we'll be sure to answer those after the webinar. We'll send a follow-up email with all of these resources that we've been discussing, so links and any other documentation that might be helpful. So Adam and Jessica, any last words that you'd like to share? Final thoughts?
Yeah, I think follow-up is another thing that has to be part of the conversation, because the interaction doesn't end the moment that people sign off and they close the webinar or whatever that might be, because that might be great, but it's important to follow up. And what I do after every session is I send a thank you email, because I thank people for taking the time out of their day and dedicating 60, 75, 90 minutes to what we had to share together. And I like to give people things that they can then use concretely in the world around them. If you enjoyed this particular wine, here are maybe a couple of other producers or regions that you might want to check out for your future exploration. And if you do, I want to know about that, because that helps not just inform me of what your experiences are, I also then am able to keep notes on your personal tastes, what you enjoy, how you approach things like this. And that gives me a more informed ability to schedule things in the future and see how people respond to the classes, what they get out of it, what they don't necessarily get out of it, and learn as you go. This is new to a whole lot of us, right? And so learning on the job and building the airplane as we fly is going to be part of this. And you have to be willing to understand and listen to the people on the other end of the conversation about how they're finding it useful, or maybe not, because we might have one idea going in, but they might have a different set of expectations going out. And that helped me, for example, define and hone in the slide presentations that I use to supplement and all sorts of things of that nature. So I think follow-up is another important thing that I just wanted to make sure we touched on before we close.
That's great.
I agree, yeah. Always having supporting documentation, making sure that there's an open avenue of communication so that you can continue to improve, and to make sure that what you're producing, what you're putting in front of your people is moving in the direction where it needs to go, and filling those gaps that might be appearing because of the space that we're currently in. So,
and if I'd be happy to share, an example presentation for things that I've done that could be potentially useful in terms of helping kind of make the structure a little bit more concretely understood.
Thank you. Yeah, that'd be great. Include that after the fact. And yeah, it comes back to expectations and compassion, right? Like you said, it's new to everyone. So, well, thank you again. Really appreciate it, Jessica, Adam. It's been great talking to you. And thank you everyone for joining. As I mentioned, we will send out the recording along with links and some of the resources we talked about. And if you have any questions, feel free to just respond back to those emails, and we will engage with you further then. So hope to see you on the next one, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.